Hello, people. My name is Vilja Hulden. I work at the Department of History at the University of Colorado Boulder. I'm a labor and social historian of the United States, and I also dabble quite a bit in digital humanities, which is just a humanities way of saying data science. So I'm going to talk about a project I've been working on for a while, and let me just share my screen here and we can get right to it. So the project is called Speaking to the State, and it's about congressional hearings since 1877. It essentially has two parts. It analyzes both metadata, so data about data basics about the hearings, and it analyzes the full text of witness testimony at those hearings. It has an overview portion, just sort of basic explorations of how hearings have changed, how many there are over time, so on. And then it has a bunch of case studies. And the case studies, I hope, will allow me to keep it grounded in existing scholarship. So we don't want to do the kind of data science where we take the data and pretend that it gives us answers, right? We want to understand that we need to interpret the data. And that's a lot easier to do if we keep things a little bit more manageable than sort of the big data of everything ever, right? So in this talk, I'm just going to touch very briefly on these few topics. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what congressional hearings are and what the data is. And then I'm going to give you a quick snippet of an overview of what we might do with the metadata and what we might do with the full text. So let's start by saying a few words about congressional hearings. So in the United States, the Congress holds public hearings on, for example, many proposed bills. Sometimes it also holds special hearings. It sets up committees to investigate matters of particularly pressing importance. But mainly this is, somebody proposes a law, and then if that law gets sort of far enough along in the process, then the Congress holds hearings on it. So at those hearings, people from outside the Congress can testify. So say a new law is proposed, for example, to create a federal program of free kindergartens for every kid in the US. So lots of people, of course, would be interested in having their say about such a law. So the Congress would hold hearings, and at those hearings, different experts and interest groups would testify. So the Congress might specifically invite some experts on, say, early childhood education, maybe some experts on the budget to testify, or also other groups would request to be allowed to testify. And these could be anything in principle, say from teachers' unions to the American Psychological Association to business organizations of private childcare agencies to maybe advocates of kids staying at home with mom and dad instead of going to kindergarten. And so all the statements of these witnesses would be transcribed, and basic information about each witness would be recorded. So yay, that's data, right? So now we have this set of data about all these people who testified at various congressional hearings, and we have the text of what they actually said. Now, a quick aside, it's of course not necessarily the case that appearing as a witness means that you have influence. Sometimes you're there just to be reprimanded or to be accused of something. But we'll put that aside for the moment. Mostly we're just working on the assumption here that the more a group appears, the more it gets to speak to the state, the more that indicates that the group has at least some kind of pull. Okay, so congressional hearings are a form of lobbying, but they are a kind of an accessible form of lobbying. And so we can see what portions of the civil society get to speak to the state in this most accessible portion of lobbying. And in fact, holding congressional hearings was actually advocated originally as a cure for the exercise of shadowy, undue influence by powerful interests, like the trusts depicted here with their top hats and their bloated bellies. So the idea was that congressional hearings, having more of them, would make the work of Congress more transparent, would open this people's entrance at the back of Congress here. So the central question of the project is, who gets to speak to the state, and what do they say when they do? And since I'm a labor and social historian, I'm especially interested in understanding the extent to which grassroots and other people's organizations have succeeded in making their case to Congress, or at least in getting heard by Congress. So let's start, let me start the actual sort of data and analysis portion of the talk by saying a few things about the metadata. So the basic data looks like this. The basic metadata looks like this. It has the title of the hearing and the basics about the committee and so on. And crucially, it has a list of witnesses at each hearing. And so here, for example, we have James Emery representing National Association of Manufacturers, a business group, and we have Joseph Powell representing a company. And so what I've done is take these lists of witnesses at each hearing, along with their affiliation with any organization that might be listed, and then done some further manipulation to try to classify the witnesses into bigger groups like workers or companies or trade associations and so on. So that then gives us a spreadsheet. Each instance of testimony gets its own row, and so there's information about the hearing and information about each witness. And here is sort of my classification of this bigger grouping that the witness belongs to. In this case, we have government bureaucrats on this particular sheet. So, spreadsheet. Spreadsheets, of course, are magic. You can slice them and dice them in lots of different ways and visualize the data on maps and on Sankey flowcharts and all kinds of things. And so here's some possibilities, and I plan to explore a variety of these kinds of things throughout the project. The most comprehensive analysis I've done so far has to do with the representation of organized labor versus business at hearings. And I'm not going to get into any detail about that at all in this talk because it would take too long. But if you're interested in it, you can check out my article in Current Research in Digital History. You can just Google, or you can go to the URL above and you'll find it. But basically, the idea is that it draws on the classifications of the metadata into groups, labor, and business, and shows you the presence of different groups at hearings about work over time. And you can see that there's some change over time. You could also combine this with other data sets like union density or the number of strikes, and then figure out, well, what does that mean, right? How do they relate to each other? And that's something that I do a little bit of in the paper. Okay, so that's metadata. Then let me say a few words about the potential for what kinds of full text analyses one might carry out. Now, I haven't done anything on this with the hearings data. So I'm using a couple of examples from other work I've done of the kinds that can also be applied here. Again, if you're interested, you can check out my article on this in another issue of Current Research in Digital History. So the first thing to note is, okay, so what's the data that we have? We say we have the full text. We don't actually have the full text. So here on top, you can see the actual transcript, and at the bottom, you see what's actually in the data. So you can see that some words have been removed, different kinds of stop words have been removed. I don't actually know why, but that's the way it is. And so there's some kinds of analyses that we can't use. We can't use anything that would need to make syntactic sense out of this text that would parse it. But we can make use of methods that simply make use of word co-occurrence in documents or of word proximity. So we can use topic modeling, we can use word embeddings. Topic modeling is basically a process where we feed the modeler a bunch of documents like witness testimonies at congressional hearings, and it makes these bags of words that are related. They're related because the modeler has found that they co-occur, these words co-occur a lot in the same documents. So if you think of a newspaper and you were to topic model newspaper stories, you'd probably end up with topics like sports, business, advertising, so on. So you don't tell it what topics you want. You say how many you want, and it figures out how it might break down the text into that many topics. And it gives you these bags of words, lists of words that define a topic. And it gives you a file that shows you how much of each of these topics a document contains. A document contains multiple topics in different proportions. So when this first came out in about 2010, it became like all the rage in digital humanities. It's kind of easy to use, and it seemed like it would be really exciting. It hasn't turned out to be quite so exciting. It's actually become kind of passé, But I do think it's useful, especially if we use it comparatively. So, oh yeah, and one word can occur in multiple different topics. So for example, I made a topic model of a bunch of small town American newspapers from the early 20th century. So this data set included sort of mainstream papers, and then it included a bunch of labor-oriented papers, papers with titles like Wage Worker and Toiler and so on. So really kind of, labor, not labor union papers, but sort of working class labor papers. And then I did some calculations to try to figure out the most characteristic, the most prominent topics in each set of materials. And this is the labor material. And you can see that the top topic is strikes. Now, strikes is at the top at all of the labor papers and really not at all at the other papers. So this is really kind of interesting. We can really sort of start to understand how much of a niche these labor papers fulfilled at the time. And then we can, obviously analyze different other topics in these materials to sort of take our analysis a little bit deeper. So comparative topic modeling works quite well. And you can, of course, if you think about this, you can immediately see how it could be applied in the congressional material. We could do things like think about topics that are prominent in the testimony of different groups. Are they similar or different? We can think about how topics change over time. It's really easy to draw a graph of a topic changing over time. We can look at how they change over time for different groups or on particular issues and so on. Okay, another text analysis that we can use is word embeddings. And I'm not going to get into any detail here, but the basic idea is that you compile counts of the contexts in which words are embedded. So you compile counts of how often other words occur, a few words to the right and to the left of a particular word. And the basic idea is that, well, you'll know a word by the company it keeps. The meaning of a word is defined by the contexts in which it appears. So you count the words around a target word, you do this for each word in your vocabulary, and you end up with these count matrices. And then you do some math tricks, and as if by magic, similar sorts of words end up close together in a coordinate system. It's actually kind of mind-blowing how well this works. And so that helps you figure out word meaning by seeing what words it is similar to. Here, for example, this is obviously a toy example, but apples are somehow similar to bananas, and Norway is somehow similar to Spain. They're both countries, both food, so on. So again, we can use this to compare two bodies of texts to see if words have the same meaning in both sets of texts, which can be really kind of an interesting question, right? So being a labor historian, I, of course, took my labor papers and mainstream papers data set and looked at words like capitalist. So the word capitalist is really not at all similar in these two bodies of texts. If it was exactly the same, the similarity measure would be 1. So now it's 0.47. That's really quite low. Now, if you look at the similar words and the context words for capitalist in the labor papers, that's not super surprising. It's clearly about work under capitalism, basic stuff like class and system and working and rule and power and struggle and so on. Pretty much what you'd expect. If, though, you look at it in the mainstream papers, you can see that the set of words is completely different from the labor papers. And if you stare at it for a while, you can actually guess what kinds of texts this is. So you might even want to pause the video and think about that for a little bit and see if you can guess. Well, it's obituaries. So the prominent capitalist so-and-so leaves behind 3 sons and a widow, and so on. So essentially, the word capitalist in these materials is about individual businessmen's identities. It's not about a system, whereas in the labor papers, it's about the capitalist system. Also, this shows you that capitalist really wasn't a term of opprobrium in the early 20th century. It was something that people identified as, I am a capitalist. So we can think about how we might apply this kind of analysis in the congressional hearings. And we could look at, say, do different groups use a particular word in a similar kind of a way? Does it mean the same thing when one group uses it versus another? We could look at whether a word like environment or democracy changes over time, whether its context shifts, and so on. So there's quite a lot of potential in doing various kinds of full text and metadata analyses. And so the basic idea here is to take this fairly accessible form of lobbying, take data about this fairly accessible form of lobbying, try to understand who gets to speak to the state, what they say when they do, and looking at both the metadata about who testifies and the full text of testimonies to understand that. We can draw graphs on the basis of the metadata, we can combine them with other data to draw more interesting graphs, and we can take the full text and analyze it with things like topic models and word embeddings. And hopefully we can do all this in a way that doesn't get sucked into an excessively messy big data vortex, but that keeps it grounded in existing scholarly debates. Thank you.